And moving into our next topic today, you can see we are joined by our patron, Pat. Pat, thank you for being here today. Quick wave, anything.
Pointing right at Sean.
Yep,
or Ricky's pointing at Sean.
Well, on my screen, Sean's on the bottom.
I got to point this way to see Pat. I'm sorry. The boxes are still confusing me.
It's stupid. Pat's all the way to the right, then Dave, then me, and then Sean's on the bottom.
Mine, it's Sean, then Ricky, then Dave, all on my right side.
Yeah. Oh, I love it.
Oh, you guys are on my left.
Discord's so messed up. Thanks, Discord, for being free, at least.
Couldn't just do this Discord so I could use my fucking background. Not besides the point.
Everyone's buying Zoom stock. They're not buying Discord stock.
Seriously, why are we not in Zoom anymore, you know? Let's go back to Zoom. But no, we've got a great topic, and thank you again, Pat, for being a patron. We really appreciate your support. We just appreciate talking to you. And honestly, it's one of the fun things we get to do in Discord, is hang out and talk to people. So you actually brought an awesome topic today, and I'm glad you did, because I think it's something that doesn't get noticed until something happens. And because the Bulls front office situation recently had gone through a series of interviews and a new head of basketball operations was hired, it wasn't being brought up. But, should the NBA have a Rooney Rule in place in order to make sure that all candidates get equal consideration for opportunities?
Well, it's looking like that's a better idea as we go along, because even though the NBA is touted as such like a diverse league where it's doing a hell of a lot better than the MLB, the NFL, the NHL, but it doesn't mean it's perfect. And I think there needs to be more representation, especially among the front offices. So people point out that, like, oh, the NBA has 6 African Americans in league offices that are the heads of those offices, with 2 more people of color, but that's 8 positions out of 30 in the league, which is primarily made up of like minority players. And there's an issue when the front offices don't reflect the amount of players that are in the league, and it's kind of this weird like power structure. And for the Bulls specifically, I know Reinsdorf came out and like was very apologetic. He was like, we're not those type of people. We had people on the list, but the fact remains that, you had people you wanted to interview, but the fact remains you still didn't interview anybody. And that itself is a failure. Like, even though you intended to interview people, the fact that you couldn't find like any other people to interview, and you interviewed like Colangelo and Wilcox and Ferry, if those reports are true, which I don't know if they're true or not, but the fact that those reports came out and you couldn't interview anybody else, that's a loss, and that's a failure on the Bulls, no matter how many times they try to submit it.
Yeah. Sean, I know we talked about, a lot of the different potential interview candidates before this was done, and now seeing the results. Like, do you think that this is just a sign of where the NBA is at currently, or do you think it is more a Bulls issue? Like, where I feel like it's league wide, but it's just not talked about, right?
I think in a way it wasn't really anything that was. I don't think this was a planned out thing. I don't think they were like, oh, we're just going to hire white people, or we're only going to interview white people. I think these were the candidates they searched out. They just all happened to be white, which was an issue. I think that obviously representation's a key part of this, but I also think that's something the Reinsdorfs know. I mean, if we look at their history, I mean, they had Kenny Williams be their GM forever. I mean, and we always look at the White Sox, and they're not afraid to hire minority coaches as well. You see Ozzie Guillen. So I don't think this is something that is a Bulls issue. I think it's just an unfortunate thing. It was an oversight that they should have looked into more. And I'm glad people are calling them out for this. This is something that should have been a part of their hiring process. But you look at the guys that they were going after, all of them were white Caucasian men, and that's the issue there. I think I don't want to speak on Bobby Webster, but they weren't able to interview him anyways. I don't know if Bobby is white or not, so I don't want to.
His mother is Japanese American, I believe.
Yeah, so I mean, they kind of had a little bit of minority mix in there, but yeah, I don't think it was an issue for the Bulls as a organization, but I do think it was an issue at least this year and in this instance, and at least I would have liked to see more representation. in these interviews, and probably 3 at least minority candidates in these interviews, because it is something that the scope should be widened, and every person should be interviewed for these jobs. If you have qualifications, if you're working in a front office, and you're a part of a successful franchise, you should be able to get a job interview for this. And I think the Bulls rushed it a little bit because it seemed like they already had their guy in Karnisovas after the first interview, which isn't an issue because, if you like a guy, you should be able to hire who you want. But I do think the issue ended up just being relying in, look at the talent pool and the people they were bringing in, and it should have been more diverse.
Yeah, and the Rooney Rule comes from the NFL. Ricky, I know you're a big NFL guy. As far as how that's played out in the NFL, I know I've seen a lot of commentary, both positive and negative, about it. How do you feel? Do you feel it's doing a good thing overall for the NFL at the end of the day?
Overall, I'm going to say no. And I get what the Rooney Rule in the NFL is supposed to do, and it does one thing very well, is you don't want basically owners and GMs and stuff to basically say, we're just going to interview white candidates. We're not going to interview African-American or Asian or Hispanic candidates. But the thing that I feel like it falls short is, like Bellamy this last year, or Benemy, I fuck up his name every time. The OC from the Chiefs.
Eric Bieniemy.
He was the Rooney, like there's always every single year, there's always one coach where it's like, wow, he interviewed everywhere and didn't get a job. Oh, I wonder why. Because coaches, because these teams have in mind who they want, but we've gotta basically that's what I feel like it's become in the NFL, where it's like, all right, we gotta find the one to interview, so that we're just you're not interviewing them because you want them to get the job. You're interviewing them because, okay, we need to hit this criteria, and I don't know how you structure it. I know that the Steelers owner has said that the NFL is going to look at examining the Rooney Rule because it's a failure in my mind, because it doesn't get minority coaches into positions. It basically creates here's the Rooney Rule coach. And I don't know if we put that in the NBA. The question is, how do you implement it to where it's actually going to make a difference? And it's not just going to be like, well, we interviewed a black candidate. Here, we did the Rooney Rule. Because that's not going to help anyone. It's just going to, what was it? Webster was the one, Sean, where he basically was like, no, I'm not interviewing with the Bulls because it's just a token.
The Raptors declined. Yeah, Troy Weaver.
Okay. Weaver.
The Raptors declined Webster from interviewing, and then Troy Weaver of OKC said that the second interview was just a token interview.
Because I'd feel the same way.
From Mark Spears.
I'd feel the same way with the Rooney Rule. It's like, you don't want me to be the GM. You don't want me to be the coach. You're just interviewing me because you have to, basically, and that's not going to help anybody.
Pat, what do you think some things that the NBA can take away from the lessons learned maybe from the NFL then and try to apply to a similar rule in the NBA could be?
Well, I would push back a little bit that the Rooney Rule doesn't work, because the biggest thing for the Mark Spears piece that those GMs talked about was the fact that you're not going to give us a chance. And with a rule like the Rooney Rule, even if you might think it's a token interview, you're still giving them a certain opportunity to talk to an ownership or talk to a front office about your skills and your credentials and what you can do to turn a franchise. So I'm not going to say it doesn't help. There was a really ugly thing where a large majority of the African-American coaches in the NFL were let go on Black Monday or I can't remember what day. I think it's Black Monday.
Mm-hmm.
Black Monday. And that was considered a huge failing of what is happening here. And what I think would be better is if the league, which the NBA is a more diverse league than the NFL at this point, and what would help the NBA out is a more focus on being open-minded about candidates in terms of there's this common thing in sports where you don't, especially with the Reinsdorfs, where they don't want to hire anybody that they don't know, whether that's a coach or a GM. And that's kind of mindset that shuts off a lot of people from certain interviews. So if they could, I don't know if there's a way to structure that, but if there was a emphasis from Adam Silver on changing the way that candidates are thought of and changing how, and when he's trying to bring up the integrity of the league and how to build a successful team, he should be emphasizing to ownership, like you should be open about anybody who can do that and not just look at who's done it before, who have you known in the past, because that's what's I think that's a big part of what's canceling out a lot of these opportunities for these either head coaches or front office potential candidates. Like the fact that Michael Finley didn't even get a phone call from the Bulls, like that kind of stung to me. Even if he had like Mark Cuban's approval, like, oh, they should definitely call him, and still nothing. And that to me was just like, oh, that hurts a little bit.
The thing that I think also kind of, I'm going to say, muddies the water for the NBA that the NFL doesn't have to deal with. The NBA is more global. So, like, you look at Karnashova, who we just signed. You look at, like, I think of David Blatt when he was hired as the coach of the Cleveland Cavaliers. There's a lot more candidates, too, for the NBA that are global that are not necessarily considered minority candidates. Where, like, the NFL, the only ones they have to deal with is, oh, we might get someone from the CFL, like a Mark Trestman, when he came over and got hired by the Bears. Where the NBA, could get someone from Russia, from Europe, from any, like Spain, anywhere where there's a basketball league that might be a little bit like there's more candidates who are not considered minority candidates.
Let's say David Blatt, just FYI, totally USA. Like he's an American citizen. He
grew
up in the
okay,
US. He
but
just
maybe I was
played
thinking he was
overseas,
playing
overseas.
and coaching overseas.
Yeah.
There's also that old Suns coach, Igor, or whatever his last name was.
Yeah.
You can count
Sean's
that,
favorite name.
Kokoshkov.
But yeah,
There's like
Right?
15 minutes of Sean saying his name wrong somewhere out
Yeah.
there. There's a clip.
Yeah, no,
Um,
Blatt was a guy that he grew up here.
Yeah,
but
it's
he was,
my mistake then.
He's Israeli, and then he played overseas as well. So he has Israeli roots, but he was born in America. I think that at least the Rooney Rule, I think that implementing it into the NBA isn't a bad idea. And also Pat was talking about it, and it's just like it is good to have an interview, whether it be a token or not, because it sucks that is the reality, that that people aren't just being hired on their credentials and what they've done, and the places that they worked and the success that they've worked. Like that's a large issue, and I don't think we're going to overcome that this year, right? If we just like make a rule, that's something that we're still dealing with the society. But I think the biggest thing is just the fact that if let's say Michael Finley goes out and has an interview with the Bulls. Just using him as an example because he's the first one off my mind. But let's say he goes out, has this interview with the Reinsdorfs, and they don't end up hiring him. But still, like what if he goes in and impresses the hell out of the Reinsdorfs, and now X team is looking for a GM, and Dolan asks Reinsdorf, like, hey, how is Michael Finley? Oh, he was fantastic. And now you're not just getting Mark Cuban saying, oh, he was fantastic. You're also getting another GM that's saying he's fantastic. So it does open opportunities if you do have an interview and you have a great interview. If you don't get hired, you can still then use that as a jumping off platform to be like, oh, I just hired. You could look at Karnashovas as well. Karnashovas was a GM, a candidate for the GM for Brooklyn in 2016. He didn't end up getting the job, but he was a fantastic interview, and he that really helped him get the job here in Chicago. He knew what it was like to interview. He knew what it was like going back, and he probably worked on his pitch that he gave in 2016 to the Brooklyn Nets. So getting an interview is important, and I think that a Rooney Rule needs to be instated just to make sure that everybody is getting a fair shot to interview. And even if they're not getting a fair shot to get a job, they're at least getting a shot to improve their ability to end up being a candidate that is really unturned downable, right? Like going and working on the ability to work on every single thing to become a GM. And I think that it sucks that that's the what we're dealing with in the world, that a lot of owners in this league are old white men that want to just hire white guys, which is unfortunate. But I do think that in stating a Rooney Rule now will at least give the opportunity for African American men to work their way up in the NBA and get these higher jobs.
Yeah, and I mean, I agree with that. It's kind of like I think of Mark always used to say when it came to job interviews, where he never got nervous because he's like, just give me the opportunity, and I feel confident that I can rock your socks off. The only question I have then is, is the point of, because some people are going to have the mindset you just said, which I agree with. Rooney Rule gets minorities the option, like the chance to interview, which gets a foot in the door. It's, hey, now I can rock your socks off and blow you away. The question is, how many people out there want a Rooney Rule to basically, Rooney Rule equals hiring, not Rooney Rule equals opportunity, which I feel like Rooney Rule is more closely like, how do I want to put this? Not related, but it's more close to giving you an opportunity. It doesn't necessarily mean, oh, there's a Rooney Rule, which means it's going to mean there's more hires of minorities in the league.
Pat, I want to toss that over to you.
Yeah, it's hard to correlate that because there's the NBA doesn't have that, and the NFL has been there's some years where the Rooney Rule looks great, and then there's some years where it's just, why was that even instituted?
Yeah.
So, but I think there needs to be more like talking to, not just looking at numbers, but actually talking to minority candidates and say like, hey, has this helped you in certain ways? What ways can this be adjusted to actually help you? Because we look at the numbers and we can say, oh, that's a fail or it's not a fail, but that might not tell the exact story, which I think we're missing kind of that valuable piece of like, what does your experiences have actually been? And I know we bring up the Bulls as slightly off topic, but we bring up the Bulls a lot, and for this, which was their big example. And when we talk about the White Sox, it's really weird that the White Sox have had that success where they've been able to hire a diverse number of candidates for their managers, for their front office, with Ken Williams leading the team and having numerous diverse candidates as their manager. But why has the Bulls have not done that? They're owned by the same group, so why is that so successful and the Bulls are not? And I think that's a fair question to ask, even though the Ryan Circle can point to, oh, we've had success with the White Sox, but that's not what we're talking about right now. We're talking about the Bulls. We're talking about your other least favorite team, apparently.
Now,
I honestly, go ahead.
I just want to throw this out, and I'm not saying this is why they got the job, but like for the White Sox, I think of Renteria, who's there right now. I think of even Ozzie Guillen. Could you maybe say, well, maybe the reason they got the job is, especially like Ozzie Guillen, well, hey, we're seeing a correlate. At that time, it's not where it was now, where we see more now, where it's like, okay, baseball is more occupied by Spanish-speaking players, and there's more coming over from like Cuba, Dominican Republic, which are two of them. And like, hey, we need a coach that can communicate with them. And Ozzie Guillen, that was maybe a positive that he had that made him a prime candidate for them to hire him when they did.
I mean, you could even go further back, though. I don't think it was mainly to do with Hispanic speakers. The Ozzie hire was because Ozzie was loved by Jerry. I mean, Ozzie was a player for their team. It's obviously going to bode well for you if you played under Jerry before. I mean, that's why Robin Ventura was hired as well. Jerry loves bringing his guys back. Harold Baines was our first base coach. Tim Raines was a coach as well. I mean, they like bringing in guys that have been in the organization before.
Loyalty.
But you could even look right before Ozzie. Jerry Manuel had zero connections to this organization, yet he was hired and he was the manager right before Ozzie. And he was an African American coach here, and he won Manager of the Year. So I really don't think that. That's why I have an issue, and that's a weird thing that Pat brings up. He brings up a great point. The fact that the White Sox have done a good job hiring minorities, and then the Bulls have done a poor job of doing that. And you could just look at the fact that John Paxson's been GM for 15 years, and you could look at my lifetime. I think they've only had white coaches. So it is odd seeing an ownership own two teams and then being so different when it comes to hiring people.
Yeah, it has to come down to somebody obviously below them is making that call on who's the interview candidates, what's the criteria they're looking for. And I think Pat earlier hit on a great topic as far as it's very much a who system in these front offices. There's all these connections out there from guys who either played together, went to college together, same golf club, whatever. It just seems very much that if you're not hanging out in the same circles as these people, you're not getting these opportunities thrown at you. And I know there's a lot of, there's some nepotism talks out there. There's some different stuff as far as different roles, but like it does seem like that's a problem that I see in the NBA a lot. It's always you try to associate certain players or certain coaches, certain front office people together as like, oh yeah, that's the kind of group that I want to go after, you know?
I do also want to say too, like Bill Cartwright was the coach in 2001 to 2003, and then Pete Myers had 2 games as well, and those both were former players for the Bulls. So I think that it really just comes down to Jerry isn't really partial to black and white, I think, or Hispanic and Latino and all that stuff. I think it's just if you've played for him, you're likely going to be a higher up candidate for the Bulls or White Sox.
I think Bill Cartwright got less time than Boylan did, if we're really thinking about it. And he's actually he's actually the first tangible Bulls coach I actually remember, like have an actual memory of.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember Phil Jackson. I don't remember Tim Floyd. The first one I remember is Cartwright, then Skiles, and so forth. Yeah,
well, Cartwright was assistant from 96 to 2001, and then he got hired from 2001 to 2003. But yeah, he coached 151 games. Boylan has made it through 58 so far.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I do think one of the
too many.
Not wrong.
You're not going to get an argument out of anybody here. The one interesting thing I think is the other barrier that we haven't really touched on, which is the male to female barrier. We talk about Becky Hammon being one of the leading coaching candidates out there, and honestly, outside of her, I haven't heard a single other female tossed out in the same coaching vein for opportunities. I know there's other women who are assistant coaches. I know there's other women who are working in those similar roles, and yet it still feels like that's one where, like, last year I think was the first year where like actual interviews happened for her. Do you think that needs to be kind of encapsulated in the same vein as a new potential rule for the NBA?
I think definitely, because with more women getting into basketball and coaching and having front office roles, that should be opening it up to them. And the one thing that really pissed me off was I saw this like random video that was trying to argue that when Popovich named an assistant head coach or an associate head coach, he named Tim Duncan rather than Becky Hammon. When if he gets tossed out of a game, he's going to be the coach, and not Becky. And someone was trying to defend it, like, well, Tim Duncan has more familiarity with Pop's system. He knows what he's going to do. And I'm like, but he's only been a coach that's his first year as a coach.
Yeah.
And Hammon has been coaching for years. So like, you can't argue with me that he's more qualified than Becky Hammon because he hasn't been a coach for that long. Like, sure, he's been a player, but not a coach. And it's that kind of like familiarity and nepotism that I think if there is a Rooney Rule, that has to get encapsulated into that kind of rule, because that's going to happen. That's going to show up. And I would love it if the Bulls hired Becky Hammon. I think that would be a great hire. I think that would inject some like new blood into the NBA. And I think that would be just a great hire for the Bulls, because they need someone who's going to manage that talent a lot better than Boylan has.
Yeah. Yeah. Right here, Sean.
I mean, with me, the thing, like, I agree. Becky Hammon will get a job sooner rather than later. The only thing with adding that in is the NBA Rooney Rule is not just going to be, it's going to be, if you're going to put it in for the NBA, it has to have way more dynamics than the NFL does. Because the NFL's not there yet when it comes to like the female coaches, where yes, they have some. I know the one was that you see all the commercials about is the coach with the San Francisco 49ers. And there was another female coach, I can't remember her name, that was with the Arizona Cardinals. But they're not at the point where one of them is going for a head coaching job, where the NBA is. And it's easier for an NBA locker room, in my mind, to interview a female candidate than an NFL locker room, just because the differences in the sport and how much contact is in the NFL compared to the NBA. So I feel like the NBA Rooney Rule has to be more like, it's not just minorities.
What does contact have to do with coaching?
It's just the NFL locker rooms have a certain, and right, wrong, they have a certain attitude that's different than the NBA. And I don't know if the NFL is ready for a female head coach.
I mean, I think Tony Dungy, not saying Tony Dungy has like a very style where he's more like relaxed and he's more calm. And so I don't think I wouldn't agree with the fact that the NFL is like you need to have this kind of attitude, because I think he's an example that you don't need to have that kind of attitude. But I would also trust, like, if you look at the commissioners and who would actually do this the right way, I would trust Adam Silver to do it this point, because Goodell would probably like trip over himself trying to do it. Rob Manfred would probably talk about it and then institute 5 other rule changes to baseball. And Bettman wouldn't know what that was, to be honest. So if I would trust anybody to institute that the right way in terms of GMs and coaches, it'd probably be Adam Silver at this point.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that the one thing the NBA has going for it is the fact that it has, the WNBA as its secondary, like, hey, the NBA is here. We've got the G League here. We've got the WNBA here. Like, it's all one big family owned by the same group, controlled. And that way you do have the different avenues to get into basketball. There's not a women's football league out there that you see, young girls playing basketball all the time. You see them, the NCAA, you see them with WNBA. Like, there are so many opportunities and so many options for people to get into basketball as a girl versus football. Like, it's just a different path to get involved. And I think with the WNBA being where it's at, like, it's primed to get more women into front office positions, more women into coaching positions, because they have such a deeper level of familiarity with the game. And, you grow up loving it. It's that passion. It's everything about it. So I'm with you. I think Adam Silver has been the progressive guy as far as all 4 major sports leagues in North America are concerned. And also he's someone who I could see trying to push for better change. And, you'll get public pushback maybe, but at the end of the day, it's the right move. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that.
All right. Any final thoughts on this?
No, I'm good. I just think that, more representation is important in, any asset, any field, any company, any industry. So more representation we're getting, whether it be in basketball or anywhere else, is always good.
I mean, we study in sport in my program the importance of seeing that kind of representation and what those structures can do for society. So from an academic perspective, it is important for that to happen. But I know from a professional sport perspective, like, that's also important, and that shouldn't be discounted.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, it's not going to change overnight. It will take, even if a rule came out tomorrow from Adam Silver regarding this, it is a long ongoing process. It's just they have to start making those steps now to set up for future success in the NBA, and then eventually across all 4 leagues. I think that's definitely the thing to keep in mind,
Yeah, none of this is also a shot at Arturis in any way. Like,
no.
none of what we're saying is saying that, like, he shouldn't have been the GM, because I'm not saying that. I don't agree. I think that was a good hire, but I think they should have done it in a more thoughtful way and actually followed through on, like, what they plan to do. But I'm not going against the hire at all. I think he'll do a pretty good job, mostly because I'm sick of Garpax. So anybody not them is probably sunshine and rainbows at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. You have to be positive at this point. Anything is better than what we've got in place now. All right. I think that'll do it. Thank you so much again for joining us. It has been a fantastic segment, Pat. I appreciate it. I can't wait till our next one next month. I love chatting with every one of our patrons, and we get different discussions, and your background kind of allows us to take a different step back and a different perspective brought to the table. So thank you again.
The opposite of Sean. Sean's hashtag on the court.
Oh my God.
Damn right.
All right.
Thanks, Pat.
Yep. Thanks so much.